the mark of the ancestors. In the quiet, fertile land of Okanla, where rivers sang softly to the trees and the winds whispered ancient secrets, there lived a humble couple, Eo and Abeni. For many years, they yearned for the laughter of a child to fill their home, but their prayers remained unanswered. They tried everything: herbal remedies, sacred offerings, and even long pilgrimages to distant shrines. Yet, the gods remained silent. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky with hues of fire and gold, Eo returned from the marketplace with a story he had overheard. "There is a seer in the distant village of Oran," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Her name is Ifeoma. They say she can speak to the gods themselves." Abeni's weary eyes lit with a spark of hope. "Then we must go to her," she said firmly, clutching Eo's hand. "If she holds the answers, we cannot waste another moment." The very next day, the couple set out on a journey through thick forests and across winding rivers. The path to Oran was treacherous, but their desire for a child gave them courage. When they finally reached the small, misty village, they were directed to a modest hut perched on a hill, its entrance adorned with intricate carvings of snakes, suns, and moons. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burning herbs. Ifeoma sat cross-legged on a woven mat, her face hidden by shadows cast by the flickering flames of an oil lamp. Her presence was both serene and commanding. Without waiting for them to speak, she said, "You have come seeking a child." Eo and Abeni exchanged startled glances. "Yes," Eo replied hesitantly. "We have been trying for years, but the gods..." "The gods have heard you," Ifeoma interrupted, her voice like the rustling of leaves in a sacred grove. "They will grant you a child, but you must understand this: he will not be ordinary. The gaze of the gods will mark him, a gift and a burden. His eyes will hold power, and with it, great responsibility. Do you still wish for this child?" Abeni's heart swelled with both fear and hope. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "We will accept him, no matter what." Ifeoma nodded solemnly. She reached for a calabash filled with shimmering liquid and poured its contents into a clay bowl. Chanting softly, she traced symbols on the couple's foreheads with the liquid. "The gods have spoken. Go home and prepare, for your child will be born under the light of the full moon. But remember, his path will not be easy, and neither will yours." Months passed, and just as Ifeoma had foretold, Abeni gave birth on the night of a full moon. The midwives gasped in awe as they held the baby boy. His skin was smooth and radiant, but it was his eyes that left them speechless. They shone like molten gold, glowing faintly even in the dim light of the hut. Abeni, despite her exhaustion, smiled as she cradled him. "We will name him Ajoni," she whispered. "He is a gift from the gods. A fighter, a survivor." But it did not take long for the villagers to notice the strangeness of the child. As Ajoni grew, his eyes would glow brighter whenever he felt strong emotions, whether it was the innocent joy of laughter or the bitter sting of frustration. The villagers began to whisper, calling him the cursed child and the boy with the spirit eyes. Children were warned to stay away from him, and adults avoided his family whenever possible. One fateful day, a group of children, emboldened by mischief, threw stones at Ajoni while he sat by the riverbank. As one struck his arm, he cried out, his eyes blazing with an intense golden light. The children screamed in terror and ran back to the village, spreading tales of how Ajoni's eyes could summon spirits to harm those who angered him. Eo and Abeni, heartbroken by the rejection of their son, made a difficult decision. They withdrew Ajoni from the outside world, keeping him hidden within the safety of their home. They taught him to read, write, and speak with wisdom far beyond his years, but they could not shield him from his loneliness. "Why am I different, Mama?" Ajoni asked one evening as Abeni tucked him into bed. His glowing eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Why can't I play with the other children?" Abeni's heart ached, but she forced a gentle smile. You are not different, my son. You are special. The gods have chosen you for something greater than any of us can understand. Ajani nodded, though her words did little to ease the ache in his chest. He longed for a friend, someone who could look beyond his strange eyes and see the boy behind them. But deep down, he feared that day would never come. As he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was meant for something more, something that would one day lead him far beyond the walls of his family's home. A lonely childhood. Years passed, and the quiet isolation of Ajani's world became his normal. His parents, Eo and Abini, tried their best to make life within their home rich with love and learning, but no amount of affection could erase the emptiness that gnawed at Ajani's heart. He often sat by the window of their small mud brick house, his golden eyes peering through the thin curtains, watching the life he could never join. Outside, children played in the dusty village square, their laughter echoing like a song carried by the wind. Mothers gossiped as they pounded yam, and farmers returned from their fields, shoulders heavy with harvest but faces light with smiles. It was a life so close, yet so far from Ajani's reach. The children of the village had given him a nickname, the Spirit Boy. They whispered stories about him, tales that grew wilder with each retelling. Some said his glowing eyes were a curse from the gods, a punishment for sins committed by his ancestors. Others claimed he could summon spirits to haunt those who angered him. Fear of these stories kept the children away, and when they passed his house, they quickened their pace, avoiding even a glance at the windows where they knew Ajani often sat. "Look, it's the Spirit Boy," a boy once whispered to his friends, pointing at the curtain that barely concealed Ajani's silhouette. They threw small stones at the window before running off, their laughter mingled with fear. Ajani didn't react, but inside, his heart sank a little deeper. He became a ghost in his own village, watching life unfold without him. He learned to find solace in small things, the rustling of leaves, the gentle chirping of crickets, and the way the sunlight painted patterns on the walls of his room. But even these comforts couldn't fill the void left by loneliness. One hot afternoon, everything changed. Ajani was sitting by his window as usual, pretending to read a book but secretly watching the bustling street. A cart piled high with baskets of yam trundled by, pulled by a tired donkey. Villagers went about their day as usual, their chatter filling the air. Then, a moving cart caught Ajani's eye. It stopped in front of the house across the street, a house that had been abandoned for months. A man and a woman stepped out, their arms laden with belongings, followed by a girl about Ajani's age. She was unlike anyone he had seen before. Her skin glowed like polished ebony under the sun, and her thick, braided hair was tied back with a bright yellow scarf. She carried a small box in her hands and looked around with wide, curious eyes. When she smiled, her whole face lit up, and Ajani felt his breath catch in his throat. He watched as she helped her parents unload the cart, laughing as she balanced the pot on her head. Her voice, soft yet full of life, floated across the street. Ajani couldn't look away. For the next few days, he kept an even closer eye on the house across the street. Every morning, the girl came out to water the small patch of garden in front of their home. She hummed as she walked, her movements graceful and deliberate. In the evenings, she sat on the front steps, her nose buried in a book. Ajani found himself captivated. He didn't know her name, but she became the center of his quiet world. He imagined what it would be like to talk to her, to share stories and laughter. But every time he thought of stepping outside, the fear of rejection, the fear of her seeing his eyes, stopped him. One afternoon, as Ajani sat at his usual perch, pretending to read, the girl looked up from her book. Their eyes met through the thin veil of the curtain. Ajani froze, his heart hammering in his chest. For a moment, he thought she would look away like everyone else. Instead, she smiled and waved. Ajani's throat went dry. He stared at her, unsure of what to do. His first instinct was to duck out of sight, but something about her smile held him in place. It wasn't a smile of mockery or fear, it was warm, kind, and full of curiosity. After a moment of hesitation, Johnny's hand twitched, almost lifting to wave back, but fear got the better of him. He quickly stepped away from the window, his heart pounding. What if she had seen his eyes? What if she told the other children and they came to mock him again? For the rest of the day, Johnny stayed away from the window. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the girl. Why had she waved at him? What did it mean? He wanted to see her again, but he didn't dare go back to the window, afraid she might be watching. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her image stayed with him, the brightness of her smile, the warmth in her eyes. For the first time in a long while, Johnny felt something stir within him. It was small, fragile, and unfamiliar, but it was there, hope. The next morning, Johnny couldn't resist the pull of the window. He waited until he was sure no one was looking before peeking through the curtain. The girl was there, kneeling in the garden, her fingers gently pressing seeds into the soil. She paused, brushing her hands on her skirt, and glanced toward his house. Johnny quickly ducked out of sight, but not before she caught him looking. She smiled again and raised her hand in a small wave. This time, Johnny hesitated. Slowly, he lifted his hand, giving her the tiniest of waves before retreating behind the curtain. His cheeks burned, and his heart raced, but a small smile crept onto his lips. The girl had noticed him, and for the first time, someone had seen Johnny not as a spirit boy, but simply as a boy. He didn't know her name or why she had waved, but he knew one thing for certain: his world, once so small and lonely, had begun to change. A forbidden friendship. The days turned into weeks, and Simi's presence became a constant in Johnny's life. Each morning, she would wave at him from her garden, her smile warm and persistent. At first, Johnny would only watch her from behind the curtain, his heart aching with a mix of hope and fear. But little by little, her determination wore down his walls. It started with simple conversations through the window. Simi would tell him about her day, how her mother had scolded her for spilling water while cooking, or how she had chased a goat that wandered into their yard. Her stories were filled with laughter, and though Johnny rarely responded, he found himself smiling more often than he had in years. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Simi stood outside Johnny's window with a small clay bowl in her hands. "My mother made puff puff today," she said, her voice teasing. "I thought you might want some. Or are you going to hide behind that curtain forever?" Johnny hesitated, his fingers gripping the edge of the fabric. I can't," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "You can't eat puff puff?" Simi asked, raising an eyebrow. "Or you can't come to the window?" He didn't answer, his heart pounding in his chest. Simi sighed, leaning closer. "You know, I'm not going to bite. I just want to talk to you properly, Johnny." Hearing his name from her lips felt like a gentle breeze on a scorching day. After a long pause, Johnny pulled the curtain aside slightly, revealing just enough of his face to meet her gaze. Simi grinned, holding up the bowl. "See? I don't bite." Johnny managed a small smile, reaching out to take the bowl. Their fingers brushed for a brief moment, and Simi noticed how his hand trembled slightly. She didn't comment, instead stepping back to give him space. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. As the days passed, Johnny grew more comfortable with Simi's presence. She would sit just outside his window, sharing stories of her life before coming to Okanla. She spoke of bustling markets filled with colorful fabrics, of long journeys through dense forests, and of her dreams of becoming a storyteller like her grandmother. "What about you?" Simi asked one evening, tilting her head. "Do you ever dream of leaving this place?" Johnny hesitated, his golden eyes fixed on the ground. I don't think I can, he admitted. People wouldn't understand me. Simi frowned. Why? Because of your eyes? He nodded, his heart sinking. They are not normal. People are afraid of me. Simi was quiet for a moment, then she leaned closer, trying to catch his gaze. I think they are beautiful, she said simply. Ajoni's head snapped up, disbelief written across his face. You don't mean that? I do, Simi insisted, her eyes warm with sincerity. They are like the sun, bright, powerful, and full of life. How can something like that be a curse? For the first time, Ajoni felt a glimmer of acceptance, something he had longed for but never dared to believe he could have. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Their friendship deepened as the weeks turned into months. Ajoni began to open up, sharing pieces of himself that he had kept hidden for so long. He told Simi about the stories his mother used to tell him at bedtime, about his love for books and the way he would sit by the window, imagining the lives of the people outside. Simi listened intently, never interrupting, never judging. She had a way of making Ajoni feel seen, not as the spirit boy, but as a person, just Ajoni. One evening, as they sat by the window under the light of the full moon, Simi asked, "Why don't you ever take off your sunglasses?" Ajoni stiffened, his hands clenching into fists. I can't, he said quickly. Why not? Simi pressed gently. I've seen a glimpse of your eyes, Ajoni. You don't have to hide them from me. Ajoni shook his head, panic rising in his chest. You don't understand. It's not safe. Simi reached out, her hand brushing against his. I'm not afraid, she said softly. Please, Ajoni. Trust me. Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Slowly, reluctantly, Ajoni reached up and removed his sunglasses. His golden eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight, their eerie beauty casting a soft light on Simi's face. She gasped, but not in fear. Her eyes widened in awe, a smile spreading across her lips. They're even more beautiful than I thought, she said, her voice filled with wonder. Ajoni felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in his life, someone had seen his eyes and didn't recoil in fear. He felt a warmth in his chest that he couldn't quite describe, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and something deeper. But the moment didn't last. As Simi continued to gaze at him, something inside Ajoni shifted. A surge of emotion, fear, joy, and vulnerability overwhelmed him. His breathing quickened, and he clutched the edge of the windowsill, his body trembling. Ajoni. Simi's voice was laced with concern. Are you okay? No, he managed to choke out, his voice strained. You need to go. Now. Before Simi could respond, Ajoni's body began to change. His skin darkened and hardened, taking on the texture of scales. His fingers elongated into sharp claws, and his back arched as he let out a guttural cry. Within moments, he was no longer the boy Simi had been talking to but a creature, a strange, terrifying blend of man and beast. Simi stumbled back, her eyes wide with fear. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but something kept her rooted in place. Ajoni, she whispered, her voice trembling. It's still you, isn't it? The creature let out a low growl, its golden eyes filled with a mix of anguish and rage. Simi took a shaky step forward, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. It's okay, she said softly. I'm not going to run. Ajoni's monstrous form trembled, and slowly, the glow in his eyes began to fade. The scales receded, his claws shrank, and within moments, he was back to his human form, collapsing to the ground in exhaustion. Simi rushed to his side, her heart pounding. Ajoni, she said, her voice firm but gentle. What just happened? Ajoni looked up at her, tears streaming down his face. "This is why I hide," he whispered. "This is why I can't let anyone get close." Simi knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're not a monster, Ajani," she said firmly. "Whatever this is, it doesn't change who you are." "But it's dangerous," he said, his voice breaking. "What if I hurt someone? What if I hurt you?" "You won't," Simi said, her eyes filled with determination. "Because I'm not going anywhere. I promise." Ajani stared at her, a flicker of hope returning to his eyes. For the first time, he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. The village's wrath. The moon hung low in the sky, casting its pale light over the village of Okanla. The night was quiet, save for the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind. Inside his home, Ajani sat by the window, staring into the darkness. The events of the previous evening weighed heavily on his mind, his transformation, Simi's unwavering bravery, and the terror in her eyes before she promised to stay. He had felt safe with her, for the first time in years. But safety was a fleeting illusion. The peace of the night shattered with a scream. Ajani jerked upright, his golden eyes wide. It was faint but unmistakable. Someone was shouting in the distance, their voice high-pitched and frantic. He turned to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see. A figure ran through the village square, yelling loud enough to wake the sleeping homes. "I saw him. The spirit boy, he's a monster," the man cried, his voice trembling. "He turned into a beast, right before my eyes. Scales and claws, like a demon." Within minutes, doors creaked open, and villagers began to gather, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of hastily lit torches. Fear and confusion rippled through the crowd as the man, a farmer named Kola, recounted what he had seen. "I was passing by his house last night," Kola said, breathless, "and I saw him talking to that girl, Simi. Then he changed. His body twisted, his skin turned to scales. I swear it. He's cursed, a danger to us all." Gasps erupted from the crowd. Mothers clutched their children closer, and whispers of fear and anger spread like wildfire. "How long has this been going on?" an elder asked, his voice heavy with suspicion. "How many of our children have been exposed to this abomination?" "We've let this family live among us for too long," another voice added. "They've brought a curse upon this village." The mob's anger swelled, and soon, someone shouted, "We must drive them out." Inside the house, Ajani's parents, Eo and Abeni, woke to the sound of angry voices growing louder. Abeni rushed to Ajani's side, her face pale with fear. "What's happening?" she asked, but the look in her eyes showed she already knew. Ajani swallowed hard, his heart racing. "Someone saw me, after I transformed." Before they could say another word, the sound of pounding fists on the door filled the air. "Open up," a voice demanded. "Bring out the spirit boy." Abeni clutched Ajani's arm tightly, while Eo stepped forward, his face set in determination. He opened the door a crack, facing the crowd outside. "What is the meaning of this?" he asked, his voice steady. Kola stepped forward, his face twisted in fear and anger. "Your son is a monster," he spat. "We've seen the truth. He's cursed, and he's a danger to us all." "Ajani is not a monster," Eo said firmly. "He's just a boy with a gift he didn't ask for." But the crowd was unmoved. "That's not a gift," a woman shouted, pointing at the house as if it were a plague. "It's a curse, and we won't let it destroy our village." Abeni stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she begged, "he's never harmed anyone. He's just a child. A child who turns into a beast." Kola countered, and murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. The village chief, an older man with a deep, commanding voice, raised his hand to silence the mob. "Enough," he said, stepping forward. His gaze was stern as he looked at Eo and Abeni. "Is it true?" Does your son carry this curse? Eo hesitated, but there was no point in lying. Yes, he admitted, his voice heavy with resignation. But he has never used it to harm anyone. He is still our son, and he deserves to live in peace. The chief's expression darkened. Peace is not possible when fear grips the hearts of the people. If this boy's presence puts the village at risk, we cannot ignore it. The crowd erupted in agreement, their voices rising in anger. Before the chief could pass his judgment, a new voice cut through the chaos. Wait. Simi pushed her way through the crowd, her face flushed but determined. She stood before the chief, her back to the mob, shielding Ajoni's family with her small frame. This isn't his fault, she said firmly. Ajoni didn't choose to be born this way. He's not a monster, he's just a boy, like any of us. The villagers stared at her in shock. You've been speaking to him, one of them asked, horrified. You've seen what he is. I have, Simi replied, lifting her chin. And I'm still standing here. He's not dangerous, he's scared. Just like you're scared now. The chief frowned, his eyes narrowing. You speak boldly, girl, but fear is not without reason. If this boy loses control, who will protect us? I will, Simi said, her voice unwavering. Because I know him. He's kind, and he's strong. He's only ever wanted to belong, but you've all treated him like he's less than human. How can you expect him to control his power when you've never given him a chance? Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. For a moment, there was silence. Then the chief spoke, his tone grim. Whether or not he means harm, the fact remains, his power is dangerous. Fear has taken root in this village, and that fear will not simply disappear. For the safety of all, Ajoni must live. Simi's eyes widened in shock. No. You can't do this. The chief ignored her. He turned to Eo and Abeni, his expression hard. You have until nightfall to leave the village. If you remain after that, we will have no choice but to take action. Abeni let out a choked sob, while Eo stood frozen, his fist clenched at his sides. Simi turned to Ajoni, who had been listening from the doorway, his golden eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and guilt. Ajoni, she said softly, reaching for his hand. I'm so sorry. Ajoni shook his head, his voice barely audible. It's not your fault, Simi. I should have stayed hidden. No, she said firmly, her grip tightening. This isn't your fault. You don't deserve this. But the decision had been made. As the villagers dispersed, their torches casting long shadows on the ground, Ajoni and his family began to pack their belongings. Simi stayed by his side, her heart heavy with anger and sadness. When the time came for them to leave, Ajoni turned to Simi one last time. Thank you, he said, his voice trembling. For everything. She hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. This isn't goodbye, she whispered. I'll find you again, Ajoni. I promise. As Ajoni and his family disappeared into the darkness, the village seemed to exhale, as if a storm had passed. But for Simi, the emptiness left in their wake was unbearable. She vowed, in that moment, that she would keep her promise, no matter what it took. A journey of redemption. The forest stretched endlessly before them, its dense canopy casting dappled shadows on the ground. Ajoni and Simi moved cautiously through the undergrowth, their steps muffled by the soft carpet of fallen leaves. The air was thick with the scent of earth and wildflowers, and the distant calls of birds echoed through the trees. Despite the beauty surrounding them, the weight of their mission pressed heavily on their shoulders. Simi glanced at Ajoni, who walked a few steps ahead, his eyes scanning their surroundings. He seemed more confident than she had ever seen him, his back straight and his steps purposeful. But she could sense the turmoil within him, the questions he hadn't voiced, the doubts he tried to hide. Do you think we'll find him? Simi asked, breaking the silence. Ajani glanced back at her, his golden eyes catching the light through the trees. Adebayo is more than just a healer, he replied. He's said to have a connection to the gods. If anyone can help me, it's him. Simi nodded, though she couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. The stories of Adebayo were as much legend as they were fact, and the thought of meeting someone so deeply tied to the divine both excited and frightened her. As the days turned into weeks, the journey tested them in ways they hadn't anticipated. The forest was alive with dangers, hidden pits, venomous snakes, and unpredictable weather that turned the paths into muddy quagmires. But the greatest threat came one evening as they made camp near a quiet stream. Simi was tending to the fire when a rustling in the bushes made her freeze. She reached for Ajani, who had been gathering wood nearby. Before either of them could react, a group of bandits emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by crude masks. They carried crude weapons, machetes and clubs, and their eyes glinted with malice. "Well, what do we have here?" one of the bandits sneered. "A couple of travelers lost in the woods. Looks like you've got some supplies we could use." Ajani stepped in front of Simi, his hands clenched into fists. "We don't want any trouble," he said, his voice calm but firm. The bandits laughed, their leader stepping closer. "Trouble's already here, boy. Hand over your belongings, and we might let you walk away." Simi's heart pounded as she watched Ajani. She could see the tension in his body, the way his jaw tightened and his breathing grew shallow. She knew what was coming. "Leave us alone," Ajani said, his voice lower now, almost a growl. The leader smirked. "Or what?" In an instant, Ajani's body began to change. His skin darkened and hardened, taking on the texture of scales. His fingers lengthened into sharp claws, and his eyes glowed with a fierce golden light. The bandits stumbled back, their bravado replaced by fear. What is he?" one of them stammered. Ajani didn't answer. With a swift, calculated motion, he swiped his claws through the air, striking the leader's machete and sending it flying into the bushes. The other bandits scattered, their screams echoing through the forest as they fled into the night. Simi stood frozen, her eyes wide as she watched Ajani's transformation. Despite having seen it before, it still left her breathless, not with fear, but with awe. She stepped closer as his scales receded and his claws shrunk back into human hands. "You didn't hurt them," she said softly. Ajani turned to her, his expression conflicted. "I could have," he admitted. "But I didn't want to. That's not who I am." Simi placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "That's why you're going to beat this curse," she said firmly. "Because you're stronger than it is." After weeks of travel, they finally reached the edge of a vast clearing. In the center stood a small hut, its thatched roof weathered but intact. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and the air around it felt charged, as though it hummed with unseen energy. "This must be it," Ajani said, his voice tinged with both relief and trepidation. They approached the hut, and before they could knock, the door creaked open. A tall, wiry man with deep-set eyes and a beard streaked with silver stood in the doorway. He wore simple robes, but there was an undeniable presence about him, a quiet power that seemed to radiate from within. "You've come a long way, Ajani," the man said, his voice calm but commanding. "I've been expecting you." Ajani's eyes widened in surprise. "You know who I am?" Adebayo nodded. "The gods speak of those who carry their mark. Come inside. We have much to discuss." The interior of the hut was simple yet filled with items that spoke of Adebayo's connection to the divine, shelves lined with ancient texts, bundles of herbs hanging from the ceiling, and a small altar adorned with carvings of the gods. Adebayo gestured for them to sit, and he began to prepare a brew, his movements deliberate and precise. "Your curse," Adebayo began, is not just a burden, it is a legacy. Long ago, your ancestor Oluwafemi sought power from the gods, but his greed blinded him. He took their gift but refused to fulfill his promise to honor them. As punishment, the gods bound your bloodline to the burden of transformation, a reminder of his betrayal. Ajani listened intently, his fist clenched. How do I break it? He asked. How do I make it right? Adebayo handed him a cup of the brew, its aroma sharp and earthy. To break the curse, you must prove that your heart is pure. You must confront the spirits of your ancestors and show them that you are not like Oluwafemi, that you seek not power, but peace. Ajani's gaze hardened with determination. I'll do whatever it takes. Adebayo's eyes softened. It will not be easy. The spirits will test you, force you to face your deepest fears and darkest truths. But if your heart is truly pure, the curse will be lifted. Simi reached for Ajani's hand, her grip firm. You're not doing this alone, she said. I'll be with you, every step of the way. Adebayo nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. Your bond will be your strength. Trust in it, and in yourself. As night fell, Adebayo led them to the mouth of a sacred cave, its entrance marked by ancient carvings that glowed faintly in the moonlight. This is where your trial begins, he said, his voice solemn. Enter with courage, and may the gods guide you. Ajani and Simi exchanged a glance, their resolve mirrored in each other's eyes. Together, they stepped into the cave, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The trial of the ancestors. The entrance to the sacred cave loomed before them, its jagged edges framed by twisting vines and an eerie, pulsating glow emanating from within. The air around it was heavy, thick with a presence that seemed to press against their chest. Ajani stood at the threshold, his golden eyes dim with apprehension, as Simi placed a reassuring hand on his arm. You don't have to face this alone, she said, her voice steady but gentle. Ajani turned to her, his gaze conflicted. This is my burden, Simi. You've already done so much for me. I can't ask you to. You didn't ask, she interrupted, her expression firm. I'm here because I want to be. We started this journey together, and we'll finish it together. He nodded, a flicker of gratitude crossing his face. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped into the cave, Simi following close behind. The cave was alive with whispers. Voices echoed from every direction, soft yet insistent, as though the walls themselves were speaking. Faint images flickered in the shadows, faces half-formed, shifting like smoke. Ajani could feel their eyes on him, watching, judging. Ajani of Okanla, a deep, resonant voice boomed, silencing the whispers. You stand before the spirits of your ancestors, bearing the burden of a pact forged long ago. Do you come to seek redemption? Ajani's voice trembled as he replied, I do. I want to understand why I was cursed, and how I can break it. The air grew colder, and a faint figure materialized before him. It was an elder, cloaked in flowing robes, his eyes glowing with the same golden light as Ajani's. This curse is not yours alone, the spirit said. It was born of a choice made by your forefather, Oluwafemi, who sought power from the gods but failed to honor his end of the bargain. His greed bound our bloodline to this curse, a curse of power, but also of fear and isolation. Ajani's fist clenched. I didn't choose this. I never asked for this power. No, the spirit said, its voice tinged with sorrow. But you carry it nonetheless. To break the curse, you must prove that you are worthy of redemption. That your heart is pure, untainted by greed, anger, or hatred. Are you prepared to face the truth of your soul? Ajani hesitated, fear flickering in his eyes. Then he glanced at Simi, her steady presence grounding him. I am, he said, his voice stronger this time. The elder spirit nodded, and the ground beneath them began to shift. Simi let out a startled cry as the cave dissolved into a swirling vortex of light and shadow. When the world reformed, they stood in a vast, empty void, the only sound the steady thrum of Ajoni's heartbeat. The first test began without warning. The void darkened, and Ajoni found himself standing in the village square of Okanla. Children laughed and played, villagers bustled about, and the sun shone brightly. For a moment, it felt real, normal. But then the villagers stopped. One by one, they turned to look at him. Their faces twisted with fear and disgust as they pointed and whispered. Monster. Abomination. Spirit boy. Ajoni's chest tightened. He tried to speak, to explain himself, but no words came out. The whispers grew louder, the villagers closing in on him, their faces contorted into grotesque masks of hatred. He stumbled back, his hands trembling, as his golden eyes began to glow uncontrollably. Ajoni. Simi's voice cut through the chaos, grounding him. She appeared beside him, her presence steady and unyielding. Look at me, she said, grabbing his hand. This isn't real. They don't define you. He focused on her, her words a lifeline in the storm of his fear. Slowly, the villagers faded away, their whispers silenced. The void returned, and Ajoni realized the first test was over. The second test followed immediately. Ajoni stood alone in a small, dimly lit room. It was his childhood home, but it felt emptier, colder. He saw himself as a boy, sitting by the window, watching the world outside. The younger version of himself turned to him, his golden eyes filled with tears. Why did they leave me? The boy asked, his voice breaking. Why am I always alone? Ajoni's throat tightened. He remembered the pain, the longing, the endless nights of staring at the stars and wishing for a friend, a connection. You were never truly alone, Ajoni said, kneeling before the boy. You had your parents. And now, you have Simi. You've always been loved, even if you couldn't see it. The boy's tears slowed, and his small hand reached out to touch Ajoni's. The room dissolved, leaving behind the void once more. The final test was the most harrowing. Ajoni found himself transformed, his body covered in scales, his claws glinting in the dim light. He stood over Simi, who lay on the ground, her eyes wide with fear. His heart pounded as he realized what he had done. She was hurt because of him. No, he whispered, his voice shaking. I would never hurt her. You are a danger, a voice boomed around him. This is your true form, Ajoni. You cannot escape it. Ajoni's claws trembled as he looked down at Simi. But then her voice, faint but steady, reached him. This isn't you, she said, her gaze unwavering. You are not a monster, Ajoni. You are more than this. Her words pierced through his fear, and Ajoni looked down at his hands. Slowly, the scales began to recede, his body returning to its human form. He knelt beside Simi, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry, he whispered. For everything. Simi smiled, reaching up to touch his face. You don't have to apologize for being who you are. I see you, Ajoni. All of you. And I'm not afraid. The void shattered, and Ajoni found himself back in the cave, the spirits of his ancestors standing before him. The elder stepped forward, his expression solemn. You have faced your fears and proven that your heart is guided by love, not malice, the spirit said. You have broken the chain of fear and hatred that bound our bloodline. The curse is lifted. Ajoni felt a weight lift from his chest, his golden eyes shining with relief. He turned to Simi, who was smiling through her tears. You did it, she said softly. No, Ajoni replied, taking her hand. We did it. The spirits began to fade, their voices a faint whisper of blessings and gratitude. As the cave grew quiet once more, Ajoni and Simi stood together, ready to face whatever lay ahead, this time, as equals, unburdened by fear. A new dawn. The sun rose over the village of Okanla, painting the skies in soft hues of orange and pink. For the first time in years, Ajani felt the warmth of its rays on his face without the weight of fear or shame. The curse that had once defined his life was gone. His golden eyes, once a symbol of his burden, now shone with an ordinary, human light. Though the glow had faded, the clarity in his gaze revealed something far greater: peace. Simi walked beside him as they approached the village gates. Her presence was steady, her hand brushing against his in quiet reassurance. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Ajani hesitated for a moment, looking up at the village he had been forced to flee. Memories of rejection and fear flickered through his mind, but he took a deep breath and nodded. "I'm ready," he said. It's time they saw the truth. When they stepped into the village, the first person to notice them was a small boy playing near the square. He froze, his eyes widening in recognition, and then bolted toward the nearest hut. "He's back. The spirit boy is back," the child shouted, his voice carrying through the quiet morning. The villagers emerged slowly, their expressions a mix of curiosity, fear, and disbelief. Whispers rippled through the growing crowd. "Is it really him? Why would he come back? Has he brought harm with him?" Ajani stood tall, his heart pounding but his resolve unshaken. He stepped forward, his voice calm but clear. "I've returned to show you that I'm not what you feared." The murmurs grew louder, skepticism clouding the faces of the villagers. Ajani could feel their unease, but before they could retreat further, Simi stepped forward. "Wait," she called, her voice carrying the strength of someone who had fought this battle before. "Ajani is not here to harm you. He's here to show you who he truly is." The crowd hesitated, and Ajani raised his hands, palms open, a gesture of peace. "I've been given a gift," he said, his voice steady despite the tension. "But it's not one of destruction. It's one of healing." To demonstrate, he approached an elderly woman who had been watching from the edge of the crowd. She leaned heavily on a walking stick, her face etched with years of pain. "May I?" Ajani asked gently. The woman hesitated, her eyes searching his, then gave a cautious nod. Ajani knelt before her, placing his hands lightly on her knee. Closing his eyes, he concentrated, feeling a warmth spread through his palms. A soft, golden light, faint but unmistakable, emanated from his hands. The woman gasped as the pain in her knee eased, the stiffness melting away. She straightened,